Brandon Wingo, 15. Brandon Wingo, 15. Tanisha Cephas, 16. Jashawn Banner, 6 years old. Paris Henry, 14 years old. These are some of the names of children in the city of Wilmington, Delaware, who have been shot or killed within the past few years. Between September 2015 and January 2017, over 60 children have been shot or killed in the city of Wilmington, Delaware. 5 have died. Wilmington, Delaware has the highest rate of juvenile gun violence in the United States. Not one of the highest, not in the top 10, but the highest rate of juvenile gun violence in this country. This is a city that unfortunately has the dubious name of being called Murder Town, USA by the national media. It's a city on the east coast of the United States that sits halfway between New York City and Washington, D.C. When we talk about gun violence and reform, we always get pushback. You get the same phrases time and time again. Well, we have to respect the Second Amendment. The Constitution gives the right to keep and bear arms. Or it's an election year, maybe next year. It's the same answers time and time again. But the unfortunate truth is that America has a gun violence problem. America is 5% of the world's population, but yet 31% of the world's mass shootings occur in the United States. Comparatively, other developed countries have had 0 mass shootings in that time frame. If you look at countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and also Australia, these are developed nations that have stepped up in the face of tragedy and implemented comprehensive gun safety reform over the past few decades. Best example of this is Australia. Australia once was a society built off of a gun culture. It's a frontier country that prided itself on being tough and guns, similar to America. But in 1996, Australia suffered the Port Arthur massacre, which was the most tragic incident in the country's history. Over 35 were killed and over 23 wounded in this massacre. Immediately, leaders in Australia stepped up and implemented comprehensive and sweeping gun safety reforms. They no longer allowed handguns to be carried publicly. They had to be locked away in the safe boxes. And handguns, if you were allowed to have them, you could only really use them if you were military or law enforcement personnel. No longer were you allowed to have high-capacity magazines and assault weapons. These were reforms that were implemented not over a course of decades, but within 5 years of this massacre. And now it is one of the safest developed countries in terms of gun violence. So it can be done. America, unfortunately, has suffered so many horrific incidents over the past few decades. The names become household names: Santa Fe, Charleston, Sandy Hook, Parkland, Aurora, Colorado, Columbine High School. The names keep ticking off time and time again. We think we've seen the worst, but then something else happens. So we have a gun crisis. In unfortunate circumstances, we can't even research how this crisis affects our country. Because in 1996, we had a federal ban on research on gun violence. Something called the Dickey Amendment was introduced. It was sponsored by the National Rifle Association. It prevented federal agencies such as the Centers for Disease Control to actually look at the intersection between gun violence and public health. So we know we have a problem, but we can't even research how it affects our communities. And the worst part is, we have communities that have been ravaged for decades, and decades, and decades, in which we don't have an urgent response. Could you imagine If there was a public health epidemic, such as Ebola, or even recently in the news we have E. coli, could you imagine if this epidemic killed over 37,000 Americans per year and there was no federal response? Could you imagine if Ebola was allowed to outbreak and you couldn't give emergency funds to local jurisdictions? Could you imagine if this same outbreak, could not be researched at a federal level and all emergency responses being fed to stem this response? Well, this is exactly what is happening in America due to the gun epidemic. So what do we do and how do we get here? Because we have a response after these shootings to ban bump stocks or limit high-capacity magazines or limit assault weapons. It's always the same response, time and time again. This is what you hear from lawmakers on the local and federal level every time there's a shooting. But what about the violence that occurs in our everyday communities? Communities such as Wilmington, Delaware, where a child is likely to get killed, more likely to get killed in Wilmington than anywhere else in the world. What about communities like where we are now? Well, we have to step up and implement different kind of reforms. The kind of reforms that stem urban violence are prevention and intervention programs. Programs such as Philadelphia's Ceasefire Program, or Boston Gun Project, or Richmond, California's Pay for Peace program. These programs feed neighborhoods by implementing resources and stabilizing neighborhoods. Because in these communities, such as Wilmington, Delaware, we have concentrations of high poverty, failing education system, crumbling infrastructure, and lack of health care. These are feeding the violence in addition to unfettered access to guns. So we can step up and implement reforms. Let's come to today. We're in Wilmington, Delaware. It's a hot summer afternoon. We're on the west side of the city. It's 4th and Delaware Street. We have a young gentleman, his name is Marquise. He's 18 years old. He dropped out of high school last year in order for him to go out and make some extra money by hustling in the streets, doing odd jobs. He's surviving. He's out there with a bunch of his neighborhood buddies. They call themselves a crew. Also out there is Marquise's 14-year-old brother, Tyreek. He's out there, enjoys following his brother, enjoys and looks up to his brother. Always, he wants to be his brother one day. And everyone's just relaxing. And out of the corner, down 4th Street, comes a dirty white SUV. A Glock 45 weapon points out a window and begins spraying the Tyreek, Marquise, and the crowd of friends outside the corner store. Everyone scatters. They duck. Marquise looks up. He's not hit. He's not bleeding. It seems to be okay. But then he looks at Tyreek. And Tyreek is bleeding, laying on the ground. In a rush, panic, someone calls 911. An ambulance comes within a few minutes. And at that moment, Marquise really believes his brother Tyreek will die. They rush to Christiana Hospital, which is in Newark, Delaware, a town just outside of Wilmington, and they rush to the trauma center. Marquise, at that moment, only thing he can think about besides his brother Tyreek surviving is getting revenge, because he knows who shot at him and his friends. It was a rival neighborhood gang from across town on the east side. So after a while, once Tyreek was stabilized but still fighting for his life, Marquise goes and plots revenge. Him and his buddies plan to go to the basketball courts that same evening and spray a crowd of innocent victims. So not only would Tyreek possibly be gone, but then Marquise would be possibly serving a life sentence or death penalty. And also, we have the lives of many innocent victims ruined at the basketball game. But what about if there was a counselor named Steve? Steve is an ex-gang member who's from that same neighborhood. Steve knows what exactly it is that Marquise is going through. He's lost many loved ones to gang violence. and he's a trained counselor. What about if Steve met Marquise at Christiana Hospital, and he was able to be there half an hour after the family arrived? What about if Steve was able to counsel Marquise and mediate the violence and talk to his friends and tell them to just chill out, cool out for a few minutes while they think about the consequences of violence? What about if Steve also not only helped resolve the conflict, but also could help Marquise get back into school through several meetings they had a week later? What about if Steve could help Marquise not only get his GED, but go to college? What about if Steve was able to not only help Marquise succeed in school, but also get him into a paid job training program? Well, these are the type of programs that we need in our urban centers. These are the type of programs that are severely underfunded at the state and local federal level. These intervention programs are what saves lives. So yes, we do have a gun violence problem in this country. We have the Second Amendment. There are weapons allowed to be part of our everyday culture. We are allowed to keep and bear arms, but we cannot let the 27 words contained in the Second Amendment define who we are as Delawareans and Americans. We need to invest in other methods. Banning bump stocks, banning assault weapons, and making other reforms that we always hear about helps, but it does not solve the crisis of the systemic violence in our urban centers. So what we need to do, we have to step up today. We have to challenge ourselves. And the first step to challenging ourselves is to vote. We've heard a lot about elections within these past few years, but it's even more critical now than ever. We have to vote if you're over 18. And if you're under 18, you have to encourage your family, friends, and family members, everyone, to get out and vote. Push on social media the need to vote. And you have to put lawmakers into office who care about pushing gun safety reforms, care about funding intervention programs, care about rebuilding our neighborhoods. Step 2, we really have to invest and join local and national grassroots movements. We have local organizations in Delaware, organizations such as the Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence, also groups like 302 Guns Down. But on the national level, you can join Everytown for Gun Safety, or Moms Demand Action, or the Gabby Gifford Center, in which I have worked as a legislative and policy attorney, work with their teams on solving the crisis in Wilmington. These are the solutions. These are things you can do today. You all have smartphones. You can sign up today for their email list. And the third thing you can do is organize, organize, organize. Some of the biggest movements in world's history were organized by grassroots organizations, by youth. In the civil rights era, we had landmark legislation in the 1960s, Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, that were mostly led by students. You had organizations such as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, led by young leaders like Julian Bond, Stokely Carmichael, and now Congressman John Lewis. So the youth are leading the way, and that's no more evident than the March for Our Lives movement we have today. So we have to challenge ourselves. As Nelson Mandela once said, action without vision is only passing time. Vision without action is merely daydreaming. But action with vision can change the world. Let's change the world and step up and fight gun violence.